Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo developer evangelist, and today I'm going to be talking about cool Xojo language features. Specifically, there are 6 features I'm going to be covering today. We're going to talk a bit about a couple of the built-in attributes that you can use in your projects, enumerations, extension methods, method assignment, the operator lookup feature, and operator overloading in general. So we'll go through a few slides and then we'll jump into Xojo and look at some actual examples. So we'll start with an overview of the built-in attributes. If you haven't used attributes before, they're available on the advanced inspector in Xojo, and that pops up a little window you can see here. And that shows one of the built-in attributes that it is available to. It is called deprecated. And if you add that attribute to your method or class, you can also add an optional value that would indicate what you feel the replacement would be. And then now with something that's tagged as deprecated, when you do an analyze project, the item will now show as deprecated in there, and the optional replacement will appear to let people know what they should use instead. So that's pretty handy if you're building, frameworks or APIs or something like that, and you've changed how something works and you want to make it clear to people. Another option that's available, another attribute that's available, is the hidden attribute. And this essentially just hides something from autocomplete. That's useful for methods, again, if you're building frameworks and you want the API to have something that perhaps is public, but you don't really want autocomplete to show it. It can still be called, but it won't appear in autocomplete. So it can make things look a little cleaner. So attributes is pretty simple. Let's move on to enumerations. And what is an enumeration? It's a data type that consists of a group of values, specifically named values, which I commonly refer to as elements of the enumeration. And you can add enumerations to your project items. When you do that, you get the enumeration editor, and that's where you can add the various elements. And enumerations are often a better choice than constants, because you can often use constants for the same purpose, but enumerations are often a better choice. First of all, they're more readable because the enumeration itself has a name that describes the elements that are contained in it, rather than a variety of constants that are just kind of scattered throughout the project item or the class. And if they were just constants, they may not be grouped too well unless you come up with some sort of naming standard, maybe use a prefix or something, and that just makes the constants themselves longer. So enumerations can be more readable. But the bigger benefit is that they enforce specific values. So whereas a constant, often people will set those up as just integers. And that's great. Constants are more readable than using a hard-coded integer, but it doesn't prevent the coder from typing in any integer or not using the constant. Whereas the case with enumeration, you can only use the enumeration to assign it to the property or whatever you have that needs to contain the value. And the enumeration can only contain the values you specify. So it'll prevent someone from assigning, some value that doesn't make any sense for how you want this being used. Lastly, you can cast the enumeration values down to integers, and that can be useful for saving the values to, a database or a file or something like that. You cannot cast from the integer back up to the enumeration, however. You would have to do like a select case to manually do that. And like I said, we'll jump into Xojo after I go through these high-level overviews and take a look at some examples for each of these. So extension methods. These are a fun little thing. We refer to them as syntactic sugar because they don't really change any functionality. They just make things work a little differently so that maybe you like the way your code looks instead. But essentially, this lets you call a method as if it belonged to the class. And it doesn't belong to the class in any way, shape, or form, but it kind of looks like it does in your code. And you can implement an extension method as a global method. It's totally global to the whole project. So that generally means you're going to want to put it in a module. And then you use the extends keyword as the first parameter to indicate the class that it works with. So a method definition might look like this. Here you can see the first thing is it's extending the list box, and then it has the regular parameters after it. So that would allow this find method to be called as if it were part of a list box. So you could say listbox1.find, for example. Now, even though the find method is technically not on the listbox class, it allows you to call it as if it were. And it's not really any different than if you just implemented a global method and passed in the list box as the first parameter. So you did find parenthesis listbox1 comma and then the arguments. So that's why we call it syntactic sugar. It doesn't really provide different functionality. It just changes the readability of your source code. Method assignment is another piece of syntactic sugar. And this lets you call a method and you pass it a parameter by assigning the parameter to the method rather than passing it in the parameter list. And you can see the first thing here, like my method with 42 passed in as a parameter, that would be normally how you would call something. But if you set up your method using method assignment, you could actually call it using my method equals 42. So there it kind of looks a little bit more like a property, but the 42 is just passed into the method. So yeah, it kind of simulates a property. It's not a property because it's still a method, but it looks like a property in the source code. And to implement this, you use the assigns keyword as the last parameter to specify what must be set by the assignment. So here you can see a method here. And the last parameter has assigns value as string. And the first parameter is just an enumeration for alignments. And you would pass in the alignment in parentheses as a regular parameter, and then you use equal to assign the string value, and that gets passed along as the second parameter. Operator lookup. This is an interesting and unique feature of Xojo. It provides a way for a class to handle dot notation references that are not actually class members. And an example will show that more clearly in a moment, but it's good to get a little high-level overview of it. But it essentially allows the class to dynamically look up the reference at runtime. So normally if you type, you get a class object, my class dot, property name. If property name doesn't exist, you're going to get a compilation error, right? Well, if you implement operator lookup on the class, instead of a compilation error, your project will run. The operator lookup method will be called, and it'll pass in that property name that it doesn't recognize. And then you can do something with it. You can look it up, maybe get a value somewhere else, or do whatever functionality you want. So pretty interesting. However, you do want to use it with caution. As I mentioned, it prevents the compilation error. So essentially, if you're making mistakes, typing things up, your code is going to compile and run, and you may not get the results you want depending on how you have operator lookup implemented. And the last one is operator overloading. And not a super commonly used feature, but it provides a way for a class to use the standard language operators. And there's a lot of those. So, you get the common ones, plus, minus, multiplication, all the way down to and or not and exponentiation. And then the comparison operators as well. Probably the comparison ones might be something that is more commonly used. It may not make a lot of sense if you have, two classes you've defined and you want to try and add them together. That may not make any sort of logical sense, but you may have some reason to want to compare them. All right, so let's switch over to Xojo here and take a look at some projects that show off each of these things. So first, we'll take a look at the simple attribute one. So here I have a class, and it has some methods on it. You can see the methods that have an attribute have this little red A in the corner to tell you that there's an attribute. So if I click on them and I go to the advanced tab, you can see the attribute section here. You can see what the attribute is. So on this one, I've specified that the calculate method is deprecated and people should instead call the calculate new method. And that's just, calculate new is just a regular method on here. And then you can see the other method on here that has an attribute is the hidden method, and that just has the hidden attribute. So you can see the hidden in action here. Actually, the autocomplete only has one thing. So if I press the dot here, you can see the only choice that autocomplete is showing me is calculate new. And that is because hidden method is hidden, right? So that's not going to show up in autocomplete. Deprecated items also do not show up in autocomplete. So the only thing that's available on this class is calculate new. So you can see how that functionality works. And then if I run the analyze project, and that was project menu and then analyze project here, you can see that this item is flagged with the warning that indicates it's deprecated and that you should use calculate new instead. So that's how those two attributes work. Again, generally, I mean, if your project is just a bunch of stuff that you're just using, these two may not be super useful. But if you've got frameworks and things, which most projects are going to have as they get larger, you're going to have some folder of common modules and classes that you're using. This can be a great way to allow you to update it and make it, and without having the old stuff kind of remain cluttered and mixed in with the new stuff. All right, enumerations. So here on this window, you can add enumerations just by going to the add thing for the window. And like you would add any other things, there's an item here for enumeration. And when you do that, you get an enumeration added to the enumeration section. You can give the enumeration a name. Its type is really always just going to be integer. And then you can just start adding values. Just hit the plus and you type in what you want for the value to be. And that's it. The values that you enter here are the only ones that are going to be valid for the enumeration. And then you can use it just like, regular, data type at that point. So here I've declared a variable. I call it status values, and it is using the data type status, which is the enumeration. And then here I do a select case on the pop-up text values, check what they are, and then based on what they are, I can assign a particular enumeration to the status value variable. And I can't assign anything else because it's just going to be a compilation error. If I change this to be some value that's not one of the enumerations, I just get a regular item doesn't exist thing. Whereas if that were a constant and these things are just typed as integer, you wouldn't get any sort of compilation error. You would just get some sort of runtime error later when the value you set made no sense and your program didn't know what to do. And then you can pass that sort of thing along, just again, like a data type. So you can look here at the process method. It doesn't really do anything, but you can see, you just pass it in, define it as the type, define the parameter as the type of the enumeration, and you can pass it in and use it how you want. And then this doesn't do much except just display the message to show you that all the processing code worked. So again, enumerations are pretty handy, often better than constants. If you had specific enumerations that you wanted to have an actual integer value that you cared about because you wanted to cast it back to an integer, you could actually assign it the value here like that. Normally the integer values aren't used in any way when you're normally dealing with enumerations. The only time that this value will come into play is if you cast it back. So you decide you want to save it as an integer. I think that's how I would do it. And oops, I don't think I picked anything. And so there you can see well, it actually assigns integer values behind the scenes as well. But if you wanted specific ones, you can assign them the way I showed. So it started counting them after that. But anyway, you would do the casting in this manner to get the integer value if you need it for some purpose. All right, let's see. Next one we want is extension methods. And as I mentioned, these let you add methods that behave on as if they were part of a class or even a data type, even though they're technically not. They're just global methods with slightly different syntax. So you can see I have here a module, which is generally where you want to put your extension methods. And it's got a variety of methods on here. So you take a look at the add method, super simple one here. This is extending integer and is essentially just using to add values. So you can see how that ends up being used here. I can write code that looks like this, i.add 5 to pass in a value, and it'll add 5 to whatever the integer value is. So, none of this stuff is built in, obviously, but all of a sudden it starts to give you things that look like, oh, well, I got some enhanced capabilities here of integer. It makes it a little easier to find stuff because this will show up in autocomplete. So it looks a little neater as opposed to having a global variable, a global method that you would call, more like this. Maybe that's not as obvious as this is to some people, so they might like to take advantage of extension methods so they can write code like this. And it's super handy for, adding this sort of capability, again, to classes that maybe you don't own or that are built into Xojo. So there I added something to the integer. Here you can see the use of a days apart method here. And this is extending the date class. And it's just doing some math on the two different things and converting them back to days to give you an answer. And it's called the same way as a method, as it appears like it is a method on the date instance that we have here. And the last example here is a list box, where it looks like we've added a find method to a list box. But we really haven't, because this is an extension method that is extending the list box. And all it does is loop through all the rows and checks the value of the column to see if it matches the text that was sent in. And if it does, it highlights that row. And you can see, those started off as 20. We called add once to make it 21, and then we called add again, passing in 5 to get it to 26. Days apart. I believe this is calculating the number of days till end of summer, maybe. And then here we can type in a last name. And you can see that row gets selected. So I really like extension methods myself. I find that it is a lot more readable to write things in this manner. And if you do find yourself, you have code that's in your own methods that you're repeating a lot, and you're like, this would probably be great if it were just built into this, Xojo object or, control that I'm using. Well, take it out and bundle it in an extension method, and then you can call it like this and use it throughout your projects, making it super handy. All right, let's move on to method assignment. And like I mentioned earlier, this lets you assign a value to a method rather than pass it in as a parameter. So you can see here the status bar is getting its value set based on what the user field is. And that's just a class down here. That's actually a canvas. I think it's at the bottom here. And it is just going to draw that in there. So you can see on the canvas, this is the method here, and it has the assigns value as string at the end with the alignment specified in front of it. So that's why the call looks like this. Alignment passed in as a standard parameter. The assigns part is assigned in this manner. And then that just sets a few things and then tells the canvas to paint, which then checks the alignment to see where it should be drawing things. And it is using an enumeration. And in this case, it's actually using the enumeration with the integer values here. So you can see I set left, center, and right to specific integer values. And that is because I wanted them to match up specifically with the text that I was storing in the array. So if you're setting, if you want something to be left aligned, it is in the 0 position of the array, centers in the 1 position, and right's in the 2 position. So I can map it that way. Up here is where it's assigned. So I grab the integer value and I set it right in the array. So method assignments are pretty neat. They look like a property when you use them. This totally looks like a property right here. You can see that also is just a method. So in some ways, you essentially get, kind of a method that's acting like a computed property. But it does have a couple benefits over using a computed property. The first one is that you can actually pass in parameters and do the assignment the same thing. A computed property doesn't have any support for that sort of thing. You can just assign a value to the computed property. And also, computed properties don't work with arrays in any way, but methods, of course, do. So you can use a method assignment also if you have something that you want to work like a property, but it actually is dealing with, you want to work like a computed property, but is actually dealing with arrays, which computed properties don't do. And then, of course, you have to remember the differences between how properties and methods are handled within Xojo. Methods are all virtual, so they can be overridden in the subclasses, whereas properties are not. So you can't really override them in the subclass. You can shadow them, which has a slightly peculiar behavior if you have things with the same names. And often that is best avoided so you don't end up with some unexpected results from your code. So switching to a method does give you some benefits there. All right, so that is method assignment. Now let's look at operator lookup. So here I have just a dummy class. The constructor is just creating a dictionary and populating it with some values. And the operator lookup is just looking up a particular value and fetching it from the dictionary and then returning it. And if it's not found in the dictionary, it says it has no value. So if you look at the code here, create a new instance of our test class, and I can grab something out of the dictionary, essentially in this case, by doing this. So I do c.name, and name is one of the properties we stuck in the dictionary, but it's not an actual property or method on the test class at all. And you can see if I were to actually change this to be something else, and it tried to do the compile, you can see immediately we get the compilation error. There's no member name, right? Because there isn't. There's nothing here called name. But as soon as operator lookup is added to the class, none of those compilation errors are going to appear because everything is going to be handled at runtime by being passed into the operator lookup method. So what happens here is when this command is, called here, it's able to say, all right, well, there's nothing called name on that class. So I'm just instead going to call operator lookup, and I'm going to pass it the text name. And then that method can do whatever the heck it wants. And the same thing here. It's just going to pass in this. So you can see when I click, the name gets pulled back because that is available in the dictionary. But the other value that is not in the dictionary just displays our so-called error message. So what are some uses for operator lookup? You certainly don't want to go, oh, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen, and start adding operator lookup to all your classes and going crazy. Having, specific type checking is a feature of Xojo, and essentially operator lookup removes that for any class that it's been added to. But it can be handy. I think this week we're actually going to have a post show up on our blog written by Javier, who was at XDC a couple months ago. And he's going to be showing you how you can use operator lookup to kind of build your own preferences class. So you can just start writing code, C dot, window position, and then just save windows, save positions, and it'll automatically be able to determine that should be something to add to the dictionary. And then that can get saved out as a preference. I've done that technique myself in a preference class I built for projects. It's pretty cool. You can also use it for other things like looking up, maybe you have a class that maps to a database table. You could use this technique to look up the name and match it with the column on the database table, and then maybe fetch the specific value you want and return that. So there's some interesting ways you can take advantage of this feature. It's certainly not something you would use every day, but in specific situations, super, super handy. All right, so that's operator lookup. And the last one I have here to show you today is operator overload. So here I have a class. It's just called customer. It's just got a few properties on here. But I've implemented one of the operator overload commands, and that's the comparison one. I mentioned earlier it's probably the most common one, so I figured I'd go with that one here. It doesn't make much sense to implement operator add on customer. If I wanted to add two customers together, what would that mean exactly? Would I sum up the zip codes? Probably not. So it doesn't really make much sense. But if there is a situation with two classes where that did make sense for you, maybe there was something that was more numeric based, or string manipulation made sense, you could certainly implement it. But in this case, we're going to do operator compare to allow us to compare two customer instances. Now, what does that mean when you compare two customer instances? Well, in this case, because we're implementing operator compare, it means whatever we want it to mean. So we get to define that. So in this case, I am defining what we're going to compare as the first name and the last name concatenated together. And then I can check if that value is greater than the value that gets passed in, I can return 1. If they're equal, I return 0, and otherwise, I return -1. That's part of how operator compare works. The integer values indicate if it's greater, equal, or less than. And then here, we create a couple customers. And I can check to see. This is how the comparison is done. I am checking to see here if just a class, this is a class instance, is equal to some text. And normally that makes no sense whatsoever. Class, you can't compare a class to text. That's crazy talk. But with operator compare in place, and I've specified that I am taking in the string, I am now able to compare the class to the string text and do something with it. Yeah, that's right. My comparison was the full name. So you can see that's an interesting thing. The alternative would have been, you get lots of alternative ways you can implement functionality like this. You certainly do not have to do operator compare. You could have your own computer property on here that's like that you call like full name that does the concatenation, and you could do if c.fullname equals namefield.text. And maybe you prefer that. That might be a little more readable. Maybe you prefer that. But there might be times where you want the class to actually have almost like a default value, if you will, that you want to use for comparison purposes. And that's what something like this lets you do. All right, so those are the 6 cool language features I wanted to show you today in Xojo. Remind everyone, you can always grab the latest version of Xojo at xojo.com/download. Current version is 2018 R1.1. The free Introduction to Programming with Xojo book is available at xojo.com/learn. And of course, I always like to remind people to head over to our user community at forum.xojo.com. It's a great place to ask questions, get answers. Sometimes just going there and searching. When you have a question, you'll find your question has already been answered and you don't even need to ask it. But it's a great place to chat about things, ask questions, get advice, and even answer questions if you feel like helping other people out. And of course, you can always learn more at the Xojo Dev Center, developer.xojo.com, where there's information about all these 6 cool features and many other things. You can always reach me via email, paul@xojo.com, and I'm on Twitter @Lefevre, and also the Xojo account is @Xojo. You can always tweet at us with questions or tips or just cool things you've made, or shoot me an email if you have questions on things for something longer. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.